Hello, everyone, and welcome to Live Signing. I'm Danny Valdez, and I'm so glad to welcome New York Times bestselling author Malcolm Gladwell for the live signing of his next book, The Bomber Mafia, A Dream, a Temptation, and the Longest Night of the Second World War. Malcolm, welcome, and how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you. I'm delighted to be on live signing.
Yeah, well, we're delighted to have you. And set the scene for us. Is this your podcast studio? I see a slanted glass wall.
This is a studio. I'm in Hudson, New York. I started an audio company with my friend Jacob Weisberg a couple years ago, and called Pushkin Industries. This is our. We have a little building in Hudson, New York, and I'm inside the podcast studio.
Okay, yeah. So not your home then, right? Those aren't the same buildings.
No. We've thankfully, the days of doing everything from a closet in my bedroom are over.
Very good. Well, for the next hour, Malcolm is going to be signing books and answering as many of your questions as possible. For those who have tuned in and have not yet purchased a book, you still have time to order an autographed copy and submit a question to Malcolm. Just click over to premiercollectibles.com/mafia to order your copy. Malcolm, you got my attention with your title, The Bomber Mafia. I chose to remain ignorant purposefully for this interview. Would love to know, I dug in a tiny bit, but would love to know why you wrote this book. What's it about? Why now?
There was a group of pilots in Montgomery, Alabama, in the 1930s, young men, who had fallen in love with bombers, with this new idea that you could build a plane that was big enough to carry an enormous payload of explosives and could fly really fast and really high and long distances. And they convinced themselves that bombers could reinvent war, that if the bomber was used appropriately, you wouldn't need armies anymore, you wouldn't need navies anymore, you wouldn't need troops on the ground, tanks, jeeps, anything. All you would need is bombers. And these guys hatch this idea, and then the Second World War breaks out. And they try and bring this dream of reinventing war into reality. And my book is about what happens when they do that. What happened to that particular dream, first in Europe and then in the skies over Tokyo. And the group was called the Bomber Mafia. That was first it was a kind of derisive term used towards them.
Yeah,
but they came to kind of like the term, and now it's sort of almost an affectionate word to describe this little band of idealists who came out of Montgomery just before the Second World War.
and no spoiler alerts, but did the Bomber Mafia, at least during that time, did they succeed in making the war of that time according to their dreams?
No. It's no surprise to anyone who knows anything of the Second World War that the Second World War did have armies in it and did have navies in it, and many, many lives were lost. And bombing played an important part in the war, but was by no means a decisive element in the war. So the Bomber Mafia's dream did not proceed as they had imagined it. So a lot of this book is about what happened to this. It was really an obsession with them. They really thought that they had completely reimagined how wars would be fought. And not only that, they thought they had improved how wars could be fought, because they felt that their way of fighting a war would leave many fewer civilians dead than conventional war. They didn't think you would have to destroy cities anymore. They didn't think you'd have to have 100,000 people dead on the battlefield. That didn't turn out the way they had imagined. But the story of what exactly happened is a fascinating one. And that's the story I wanted to tell.
And what piqued your interest for a World War II book as opposed to another book?
Well, I'm one of those people who's always been a war obsessive. I have bookshelves of books on the Second World War.
Really?
As a kid, I was the one who was playing war games endlessly and had toy machine guns, and I was that kid. Little tons of little toy soldiers that I would play with obsessively. I've always been drawn. I don't know why. Whether it's a kind of I've always been drawn to these epical conflicts. I've just never written about them. I've never found a story that I thought was worthy of my time, or that hadn't been told better somewhere else. The thing about many of the great stories of the Second World War have been told by some of the finest historians of our era. So what role is there for someone who's not a military specialist? Well, at the grand old age of 57, I finally found a story that I thought I could do as well as the big boys. So that's what this book is.
Yeah. And do you have first and foremost, do you have a historical interest or a storytelling interest with this book?
Both. I mean, the thing that struck me about this story is not just that it's historically important and that the struggles of the Bomber Mafia in the Second World War are really a central part of the Second World War, about why it turns out the way it does. But it's an amazing story, and it has these characters in it who are, incredible characters. And so regardless of its significance, I was drawn to it because, I'm a storyteller. It's what I am by trade. And it's rare you get a chance to tell a story with these kinds of plot twists and crazy characters. And, this book is just chock full of weird geniuses and mad scientists and ruthless generals and dreamers. And, it's just a kind of, every time you turn a page, there's some new little fascinating tidbit. So that was really the impetus for me to tackle it.
And do we say based on a true story, or are these evil geniuses like real people? This is part of
the whole thing is 100% true. This is history. It's narrative history, but it's not, it's not reimagined in some way by me. This is, this is based on interviews with some of the leading historians of the Second World War. And,
wow.
I've dug deep in the Air Force archives, and so it's my first kind of pure history book.
That's so cool. Well, so many questions have come in from people who've bought this book. If you haven't purchased it yet, you can still get it at premiercollectibles.com/mafia. And are you ready to go to take some of these questions? I know you're diligently signing away.
I am. Bring them on.
Okay. Let's go to, looks like Joe Sue in Compton, California. And he asks, do you ever look back at your books and ask yourself, why didn't I expand on this topic more?
I think always. I think it's impossible to write a book and not look back on it and wish you'd done something differently. That's just hindsight. The years pass and you realize, oh, I was obsessed with this one thing and that wasn't that interesting, or there was something else I touched on that was super interesting and I should have explored in more detail. For example, this past summer with all of the stuff about police violence and George Floyd, I've been writing about police violence in one way or another, about crime, and since my second book, Blink. Actually, I wrote about it in my first book, Tipping Point. And what happened this summer made me think, I should have done an entire book about the police. That would have been an interesting thing to do, to kind of put a lot of my different ideas I've had on this subject over the years into one book. And in fact, my next book I think is going to be about the police for that very reason. So, yeah, I think by its very nature, you do that. You look back and you think, we should have taken a slightly different form.
Yeah. Any sneak previews to talk about for your police book?
Well, I want to tell a story of the LAPD. It's the most storied of American police departments, but also in some ways one of the most troubled. It was at the heart of two of the biggest riots in this country's history, the Watts riot and the Rodney King riots. And it turns out to be talk about a story full of characters. It's a story full of characters. And it, it stretches from, the story I want to tell stretches from the 30s to the 90s. So it's a 60-year stretch of history, at a time when Los Angeles is going through these transformations, a demographic transformation, an industrial transformation. Hollywood is exploding. The city's going from a sleepy little town to a international metropolis. I mean, it's just a kind of, as a way of looking at what happened to America in the middle part of the 20th century. It's just it's an incredible storytelling opportunity.
Yeah, such a historic. When I think about LAPD, I immediately, of course, go to those riots and the city on fire and those guys having to be like next level superhero cops, not like just graduated. So, well, looking forward to that. Let's go to Elaine from New Jersey. It says, Malcolm, you have commented in the past about college admissions and the cost of college education. In the light of the recent college admission scandal, any plans on a book about college admission and cost and how we got to this point?
Not a book, but in my, I'm going to be devoting 2 episodes of my podcast, Revisionist History, this season, to higher education. In particular, what I'm looking at is the way we rank colleges and why that's so destructive. And that, if you think about the college admissions scandal, that's what it was about. It wasn't that these kids couldn't get into college. They could get into college. It's that their parents and the kids wanted to get into very specific colleges, the colleges that everyone wants to get into, and which, as a result, are incredibly selective. So this crazy notion we have that only a couple of colleges are worth attending results in this insane competition. And I want to get at, why do we have a competition? Why do we decide that only 25 colleges in this country are worthy of being called elite?
Or the special Ivy League, if you will?
Yeah, or, a lot, the scandal that the questioner is referring to is a scandal where in LA, many of these wealthy parents are trying to get their kids into USC. And they were trying to get their kids into USC because USC is a highly rated college. And, that's, my question is, why have the ratings? And are the ratings useful? Or do they just sort of screw us up? So, and in my podcast in the past, I've done many episodes on higher ed. I haven't yet decided to do a book on it, although I could certainly do a book on it. But I think it's, as a non-American, I find America's practices around higher education to be completely baffling. So yeah, there could well be a very good book in that.
That's so cool. Jessica from Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. Can you be from both? I don't know Canada.
Labrador.
Is it
I'm Canadian. I should know this. Labrador is a kind of section of Newfoundland, I think.
Okay.
I think I'm going to get so much angry mail from Canadians. This is embarrassing. But Labrador is next to Newfoundland, if I'm not mistaken. It's not a separate province, but it's a region.
Hey, I'm American, and I am not the history buff or anything I'm supposed to know about my local government and all the things every man with children should know. I don't know, and so you'll get no judgment from me here.
Okay.
But she asked, what are the most surprising or interesting ways your writing and research have impacted the way you live your life or view the world?
Well, one of the things that writing, being a reporter, teaches you is that much of what people believe, and I don't mean this in a malicious way, but much of what people believe is wrong. That human beings, by virtue of being human beings, make honest mistakes in their beliefs all the time. And that's why, as a journalist, you double and triple check everything. Because very often the first thing you hear is not true. Not because someone's lying to you, but just because the truth is a difficult thing to determine. And that's really changed. That's made me not skeptical, but a lot more careful and a lot more humble about what it means to hold a opinion. Years and years and years of being a reporter has just taught me that it's very likely that much of what I believe isn't true. And so I should be careful about how I throw my opinions around. And I should be prepared to admit when I'm wrong. And that's fine, because we're all wrong all the time. Took me years. I think it takes anyone who's a reporter years to grasp this fact, because your instinct is to believe particularly when you get something from an authoritative source. You think that must be true.
Sure.
And then it's only if you kind of enter into the discipline of checking things that you realize how often errors are made or misapprehensions are carried.
My teenagers come to me with the most outlandish, quote, truths, end quote, that I've ever heard in my life. Mm-hmm. And when I hear it, I instantly know it's incorrect. As an adult, even if I don't have personal knowledge of the information, it just sounds like outside of the realm of physics or something. But the passion by which they present the information never wanes. They come to me the next day with the same level of passion. And so I start calling it the cousin news network. Uh-huh. It's where all the families and cousins and kids I play with, they all just have this news network that goes around. Some of it's political, some of it's spiritual, whatever. But my kids come to me and they are like, Dad, you won't believe this. And it's absolutely ignorant and incorrect.
But I think the truth is that it's not just, they may have a more extreme case of it because they're young.
Yeah.
When we were all young, but it doesn't go away when you're an adult. Like a lot of
right.
What you believe as an adult is similarly flawed or inaccurate.
Yeah. I'm 40, and I would say in the past 3 years have I been able to sort of calm down a little bit with my fantastic things I believe that I preach loudly. And I've been going, because I've learned so much of it was based on something I watched or just believed subconsciously and never questioned. And so I appreciate what you're saying. Andrew from Virginia Beach, he writes, have you found a new appreciation for certain albums or music genres while making your podcast Broken Record? Have your taste in music changed at all?
Yeah, so this is a podcast I occasionally do with the producer Rick Rubin, who's
is he a famous producer?
Oh my God, yeah, he's like one of the most famous. Rick
is
like,
that's the guy I'm thinking of.
He's the
monster
producer.
Monster producer.
Yeah, and he does most of the show. I just dipped my toes in. I did Ziggy Marley a couple of months ago.
Wow.
And,
I was late to Cedella Marley's interview and I missed it. How about that? And that was like so looking for. I got the Central versus Eastern time wrong. Anyways, please continue.
But has it changed my musical taste? The thing about Broken Record is it's deliberately as broad as possible in we're interested in all, it's not a hip hop podcast or a rock podcast or a soul podcast or what have you. It's an all music podcast. And so I guess I would just say that it's about the stories behind, the people and the stories behind music. And so it deepens your appreciation of all music, I think. It sort of widened I now find it impossible to say that I am this kind of music fan or that kind of music fan. Now I'm just a fan of music, which I think that's Rick Rubin's perspective, and it's rubbed off on me. Rick doesn't, he came out of hip hop in the beginning, but he's not a hip hop producer anymore. He's a music lover, and he's drawn to anyone who's doing cool things.
Yeah, I love that. David from Fort Worth, Texas. What's the most interesting story that's never made it in a book?
Oh my goodness. Oh God, that's a good one.
You sure one didn't just pop into your mind and you chose to not share it?
Well, you try to be efficient in translating all of your interesting stories into print, but are there interesting stories that have never made it in? I know there are. Let me think about that. It's hard to come up with one. The thing is, there are lots of stories that haven't made it in that I think are interesting, but I don't know yet.
Sure.
It can take a while to figure out whether something is fascinating or not. Like, I'll give you a random example. I was at a dinner party recently, first post-COVID dinner party in a long time, and these guys were all in the music industry. They're all talking about MTV, in the early days of MTV.
The glory days, if you will.
Glory days. And more interestingly, they were talking about MTV changed the music landscape. Some bands became popular who would never have become popular before. And some bands faded away because the emphasis was now on so much on video. And I know that there's a great story in there about the winners and losers of MTV, which I'd love to tell in some way, but I'm not there yet. But there's a great story there, right? I mean, there has to be. Oh my
gosh, I'm dying for it.
Yeah, like that's sort of. So every time you meet someone who's a part of a world that you don't know a lot about, I get a little kind of tingle, and I think, oh, there's something that could be really cool here.
Yeah, have you seen the hip hop documentary on Netflix?
I have not. I think
it might be the evolution of hip hop or something else. Anyways, so I grew up in the 90s and was in Memphis and listened to rap and hip hop, and it was so nostalgic to just watch. See, I just heard the music and came up with my own, feelings about it, but to see the history and how it came about and why that, it was more of a cultural expression than it was just trying to make records and make money, but there was actually the history and the narrative going on in the city. So if you had Memphis rap versus Atlanta rap, and all of that was so fascinating. And I mean, I sat there sometimes in tears just watching it. And when I got done, I immediately thought, man, a Glory Days of MTV documentary could be really, or a story or a book of just the people involved and how it came about. And I remember when first watching MTV, I remember even back then, I remember thinking, man, this looks produced with like a home VHS. Like I could make some of these shows, it looked very basic and it wasn't all about big time production. But it was so meaningful, and it was I felt like it was raw and honest. And it was that's the part that really got me with MTV.
I remember watching The Real World.
Yeah.
Which was the first kind of, am I right? The first real reality TV.
That's the first I know is Real World. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just riveted by it. I mean, I was
totally.
I thought it was amazing.
With Puck, the nasty dude that was always like wiping snot and stuff. Just, I don't know if you remember the characters.
It's been a long time. I wonder where those guys are now.
Oh, there's the documentary. Yeah. Charlotte from Utah. My family members and I are huge fans of your work, voraciously devouring all content you release. You are also as interesting to hear speak as your writing is to read, which isn't always the case with writers. It seems that your interest in and observation of the world causes you to see a figurative thread and start pulling. What was the thread that started you on the Bomber Mafia project? Great question.
Well, I was in Tokyo for a totally different reason. And my producer and I, Jacob, went to this little museum in East Tokyo, which looks like a dentist's office. It's like a homemade museum.
Wow.
And it was a museum to commemorate the firebombing of Tokyo in March of 1945. And it was so moving and so weird. Like, it's not a big fancy, this is one of the pivotal events in 20th century Japanese history, and yet it's commemorated not with some grand professional memorial, but with really a homemade museum on a side street. And that really got me thinking, like, what happened that night? Why are the Japanese so ambivalent about it? By the way, why are the Americans so
Sure.
I didn't know anything about it from an American standpoint either. So that was the thread. That's very typical of my. I like that expression that the question asker used. It really is. That's how a lot of my projects start. They start with these little threads, and I do tug on them and see where they see what unravels. And that was where this one began.
That's cool. Daniel from Mexico asks, throughout history, Europe has been a place of constant wars and conflicts between countries. The peace that exists in those countries is recent. What do you think has been done well in Europe, and what could be done to achieve peace in places with current conflicts, such as the Middle East?
Well, they were fighting in Europe for 2,000 years before they got their act together, and they still haven't really got their act together. So, um, you know, uh, I don't know. Maybe in Europe they just finally got weary of killing each other. It went on for so long. But I think the serious answer to the question is that the institutions that were built after the Second World War, the international institutions like NATO, like the United Nations, they matter. They were alliances that had meaning, that were built in good faith, that were supported by successive political parties in each one of the membership countries for years and years on end. And this is proof that when you put your mind to it in a kind of structural way to build peace, it can work. It's worked in Europe now for 70 years, 75 years. So that's something I think to be profoundly proud of. Maybe the goal in the Middle East should be to try and build those kinds of parallel institutions that represent everyone's interests and that can serve as a kind of catalyst for peace.
Daniel from Puebla, Mexico. What would be your best advice today to a father in his quest to get his kids to read books in times of overwhelming distractions, mainly in social media, and their lack of patience to start and finish anything?
Well, that's a good question. I think about this question too, without knowing how old his children are. I wonder whether we shouldn't write off people, that maybe reading becomes a habit that we take up later in life, because as we get older, we'll go to college. You can't go to college and not read. You're going to be reading.
Yeah.
And then when you enter the workforce, we read more in the workforce today than we ever did in the past. The sheer volume of things we read now is unbelievable.
Totally.
So maybe we read in different ways, and maybe, my book, The Bomber Mafia, is available in a audiobook form. I don't think there's a distinction between listening to it and reading it. They both amount to the same thing. You're enjoying a story. But maybe the answer is just to be open to the idea that your kids are going to consume information and stories in a slightly different form, but it's not worse. It's just different, It's just like, and they may well come back to reading because there are some stories that are best told in that form. And in due time, they may all discover that.
Michael from Waterdown, Ontario, Canada. While the technology didn't achieve its intended precision, do you feel there was nobility in its intentions? Or does a misengineered device intended for destruction simply fail on all fronts?
I think that the failure of the Bomber Mafia to kind of reinvent war was a worthy failure. I want my technological innovators to have a moral purpose. I want them to set their sights really high. And I don't mind if they fail, because the thing about the Bomber Mafia is that they failed in the Second World War, but they planted the seed for future wars. And today, we really can fight wars in a way that's more humane. We really can. Bomber Mafia were obsessed with dropping bombs with precision. And today, we really can do that. It just didn't happen in the Second World War. It happened 60 years later. So dreams have to start somewhere. And maybe we need to accept the fact that the first generation often may lose the battle but win the war, which is the last line of the book.
Wow.
The Bomber Mafia lost the battle but won the war.
Wow. That's a profound point that just spiderwebbed in my brain into 13 places maybe that I can think of, but that's That's really interesting. And it's so often the younger next generation sort of judges, if you will, the previous for their obvious crimes, and maybe doesn't take the full picture into account. Wow. Jansen from Brooklyn, New York. What's the first book you remember reading that you couldn't put down? Love that question.
Well, it would be like, as a kid, it would be probably the C.S. Lewis Narnia series.
No way. That's the first real book I ever read. And I remember like halfway through the first book going like, is this about God or something? Like what? Like it was just, I'd never heard anything like it. It was the most fascinating thing, but please continue.
I mean, and then later in life, I became addicted to spy thrillers. And so, there's a long line of John le Carré novels and Stephen Hunter novels and, that I have become equally addicted to. I'm easily addicted to books. So, but it probably began when I was probably, 8 or 9 years old, reading some of those classic children's books.
Yeah. Did you ever read The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings?
Oh, yeah. Although later, they were pretty intense for me.
Yeah. I remember that from The Hobbit.
They're complicated, those books.
Yeah.
But I read those in my, my early teens, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, The Hobbit stepped me up as a reader. I remember going like, man, I had to go back and reread, and sometimes I'd be stuck on one page because I'd daydream as I was, not getting it or whatever. But I love that about C.S. Lewis's writings is he really steps you up. You sort of take on a vocabulary and eventually I remember the Screwtape Letters was the same way. I was lost for 3 letters, and then you get into the book, and all of a sudden you've learned Chinese, if you will. You've learned his higher way.
He's C.S. Lewis was a serious intellectual. I mean, he was. So you're not reading a book by some guy on the corner. You're reading a book by a guy who was a don at Oxford.
A master.
Yeah,
totally.
serious dude.
Let's go to Rhea from Houston, Texas. Have you been able to help law enforcement or local government units based on the information you have researched? I wish more would heed the lessons from the stories you share in your books.
I've never done any work directly with law enforcement. I've obviously been writing about law enforcement now for over 20 years, but 25 years. No, it's more, but I think that I sort of have heard indirectly that people in that world have appreciated some of the things I've written. And I think I've helped in some small way to educate the public about the complexity of police work. But it's very difficult as a writer to know the impact that your work is having. It's sort of, you don't get that kind of structured feedback. You just have to have faith that if people are reading your books, then somehow the ideas in them are filtering out to the world.
Makita from Miami, Florida. What, in your opinion, is the key ingredient to being content and happy most of the time?
Well, I actually, in my book Outliers, had a definition of what I called meaningful work. And meaningful work is work where there is a connection between effort and reward. If you work harder, you get rewarded. Where there is some degree of autonomy, where you're in control of what you do to some extent. Mm-hmm. And where there is difficulty, meaning where the job engages your brain and your imagination in some way. It's not just rote. And where you have those 3 things, I think you can be said to be happy at work. And notice that it says nothing about money, nothing about status, nothing about anything those. It's just about satisfying the very fundamental human needs. Mm-hmm. To be engaged and challenged and to have some control and to be rewarded. I mean, that's really what we want, right? We don't need, if I told you that I was going to pay you $1 million a year, but you were going to be working 60 hours a week taking a toll on a highway. Would you say yes? I mean, it's a serious question.
Wow, that's a powerful question.
And I think many people would initially say sure, but quickly you would realize there's no happiness.
I'd do it for a year. 1 year, I'd get $1 million, and then I'd invest.
Yeah.
That's a really great question. And haven't studies shown that people will take significant pay decreases to have a more fulfilling job?
Yeah, absolutely. Which makes perfect sense. If you, when I think of the people who have done such extraordinary work during the COVID pandemic, healthcare workers, for example.
Great example.
What is it they need from us? I mean, they need help. I mean, they're overwhelmed and working insanely hard. It would be nice if they made more money. But I think what they really want is just some kind of recognition of the extraordinary role they've played. I mean, they need that of those three ideas, that idea about reward for effort is crucial.
Yeah.
We have to recognize their effort. We can do it any number of ways, whether it's a pat in the back or more money or something, but you can't ask people to put their lives and energy on the line for a year and a half and not give them something in return that says we appreciate you. That's, to me, that's the task. I was getting my vaccine the other day, and the woman at the pharmacy who was vaccinating me, I was asking her, well, what's your life been like recently? And she's been working, she told me she works 12 hours a day for 6 days a week.
Wow.
And she looked like she's young enough to look like she could have had a family. And
sure.
That's a lot to ask of somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a point after I got my vaccination of saying thank you, for what you've done. But it's not really enough. We have to do something else, I think, to kind of recognize what people like that have done for us.
Yeah. Man, that's really good. Nicole from St. Louis, Missouri, she writes, who is your favorite author right now?
Well, I always give the same answer to this question, which is there's a New Yorker writer called Janet Malcolm, who is the kind of gold standard for nonfiction writing. She's been writing for 30 years. She's, I think, a genius. In my wildest dreams, I would hope to be half as good as Janet Malcolm.
Wow. Do you have a favorite work of hers?
I mean, there's so much good stuff. She wrote a book called The Journalist and the Murderer, which is amazing. But anything, you can literally go and buy any book by Janet Malcolm and you will not be disappointed.
Wow.
She's as good as it gets.
Fiction mostly?
No, all nonfiction.
Okay.
I mean, I'm drawn to her because she's doing what I want to do, but only better.
Wow.
She does these deeply reported stories about complicated issues.
Okay. Very nice. Michael from Portland, Oregon, the scariest thing you've ever done and how one might overcome such trepidation, please do tell.
Scariest thing I've ever done. What is that? I don't really get scared.
Really?
I mean, I'm scared of heights, I guess.
Okay.
So I'm not going to jump out of an airplane.
Never.
But I'm not. It's a really good question. Just don't I'm not someone who, maybe I should be more fearful. I'm just not. Not. I heard it from my dad, who wasn't scared of a single thing his entire life. So, don't know if I can answer that question.
Yeah.
I have to think about it more.
Well, Malcolm, the scariest thing I've ever done is I tried an open mic comedy night at a local comedy club, and it was the scariest and hardest thing I've ever done in my life, to make a room full of cynical fellow comics who are also nervous and scared
laugh
at your jokes, and that's your one job. Um, man, if you want to purge what's left of your ego, I
Yeah.
highly recommend.
See, I would find that an incredibly difficult thing to do. I would almost certainly fail at it, but I don't find it scary. I would just think it would be hilarious. I mean, like that's my position. My position is like no one expects me to be a stand-up comedian, so I have nothing. I don't have anything on. Nothing's on the line here. Would I try it? Yeah, I'll try it. And if they all boo me, well, I wasn't. It's
Yeah,
like I wasn't going to succeed. I mean, like it's
yeah,
not like I, you know. So yeah, I just don't. I guess I don't interpret some of these things as scary.
yeah. I went in with my friends and family all thinking that I was a super funny guy. And that's why I went. And I
Oh, see,
learned that
there's your problem right there. You
that
gotta like, you gotta come in a little bit low. You gotta
I went in
don't
way
come in
too
so
hot.
hot, Danny.
Oh man, I came in screaming hot and I plummeted into the earth and never returned. So, Jennifer from North Carolina, what is your best advice for a data scientist who wants to make a difference?
Um, tell stories. So data for data scientists, they see the story they see the pattern in the numbers naturally. They're trained to do that. Their numbers are there's a language, beauty to numbers. That's but for the rest of us, we don't have that natural. We can't make sense of numbers in the same way. So I think data scientists who think about how can I make the patterns I see naturally obvious to people who aren't number people, right? Can I use these? And that may be as simple as finding a way to represent the patterns visually. That may be a way of trying to represent the numbers emotionally. I remember once jokingly, my dad was a mathematician. There was some research paper I ran across about these guys who had discovered the world's largest number. I don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
And I told my dad the number, and he had an emotional reaction. He was like, "Oh my God, that's a large number." Like he got really excited. And that was him telling a story about data, right?
Yeah.
He was
Yeah.
telling me that this thing was not a goof, it was real. And for someone like him, that was exciting. Like whatever these people had done was something, for him, it was like looking at an art lover going to a museum and seeing a Picasso.
Sure.
And that's what I mean. There's many ways to tell a story about numbers, but that's, I think, the challenge for people who are on the inside is to try and understand a way of communicating their excitement or fascination to the rest of us.
And if you can't figure it out, maybe partner with a creative, right?
Yeah.
Sherry from Knoxville, Tennessee, real close to us. I found your book Blink helped me with so many things. What is your favorite parts of Blink?
Oh, wow. That's many years now. I was a young man when I wrote that book. I am no longer a young man. I mean, there were some fun stories in there. The story of the Marine Corps general who took on the Army in a war game based on the Iraq invasion, and he was playing Iraq and he won. I always remember that one. That's a very humbling one. Because he was so interesting, that guy. I went out to see him in Quantico. And he told me this, it's both hilarious and before the Iraq War, the Army does a war game, as the often do, and they invited this guy who was a very seasoned, hardcore Marine Corps general. His job was to play Iraq prior to the Iraq invasion. Play Iraq in a war game. Let's game it out. See what happens. He won, which the Army was not prepared for. They thought it was going to be a cakewalk. They thought they were going to be in and out of there in no time. And he beat them at their own game. And it should have served as a warning that the Iraq War was not going to be this piece of cake. That story is told in Blink, and it's always been one of my favorites. He was such a great character, and the story itself was so, I thought, important and powerful.
Mohammed from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. How our obsession with mobile devices and social networks, or how will our obsession with mobile devices and social networks impact the future of our species?
Well, the short answer is I don't know, and nor does anyone. The longer answer is it's early. So human beings, if you look at the history of the telephone, I always loved telling this story. It takes us about 50 years to figure out what the telephone's for, which is really surprising. It's invented in the 1870s, or actually earlier, but we have working telephones by the 1880s, and it's not till the 1920s that people get it. They get it that they think it in the beginning that it's a business device, that it's for communicating business information. They don't understand that it's a social device.
Wow.
They don't understand it's for gossiping with your friends, right? Who you can't see face to face. That's what the phone really is. Mm-hmm. For calling your mom when you haven't talked to her in a while and saying hello. That's bottom line is what the telephone's for.
Yeah.
It takes 50 years for people to figure that out. So, we're just in the infancy of Facebook, Twitter,
it's a great
Instagram.
Point. Yeah. Yeah.
So do I know, are we using them now the way we'll use them 20 years from now or 30 years from now? Probably not. Based on our history with previous versions of these things.
Sure.
It takes a long time for us to adapt.
You think people will socialize with technology 50 years from now?
I assume so.
Yeah.
One thing I wonder about with COVID is whether there's going to be a backlash and people are really want to. For the first time last week, I did some in-person interviews, first time in a year and a half, for my reporting for my podcast. They were so much fun. And I got so much good stuff. And I was like, why did I ever think that I could do everything on Zoom? Zoom's useful. It's allowed us to do this today. But this would have been a lot more fun face-to-face. And we're going to be reminded of that, I think. And there's going to be a big swing back towards, it's okay that it's a little less efficient if one of us has got to fly somewhere. And
yeah,
it's fine. But the point of work and life is not to be efficient. It's to enjoy ourselves, to have meaningful experiences.
I agree 1,000,000%.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be backlash like gushy love fest. We're not only in the room, we're way closer than we would ever have imagined. Our seats are next. We are shoulder to shoulder. Yeah. I at least that's my hope. Lauren from Bloomington, Illinois. How do compassion and discernment come into play in your investigative work?
Well, my job is not just writing about things, it's talking to people. The first half of everything I do is interviews. Every book I write or every season of my podcast I do, I interview dozens of people. And those two words are lovely, discernment and compassion, that you quickly learn not quickly, it takes a long time, but I've been interviewing people now for 35 years. And you learn that you learn the most from people and get the best from people when you do treat them with compassion and discernment, when you learn how to listen to them and you learn how to be patient with them and you learn how to let them tell their own stories without pushing them in one direction or another. When you are comfortable with their imperfections, when you can communicate your levels of empathy to them, all those are all things that make the kind of conversations that are a huge part of my job possible. Took a long time to figure that out. It's not the way I did interviews when I was 25. So you realize you're entering into a kind of relationship with someone when you interview them. You're asking to see the world through their eyes, and that's a pretty big responsibility.
And it's an ask of them to be vulnerable, um, uh,
Yeah,
often when you've just only met them for the first time, and now
yeah.
you're asking them very personal things, and that's absolutely not a light thing. Colin from North Dakota, any general tips for effective communication with your students? I'm a 7 through 12 English and social studies instructor in North Dakota. Thanks.
Wow, that's an interesting question. I mean, I'm reluctant to give a teacher advice on how to teach. I'm not a teacher. I mean, I'm a kind of teacher, but I'm the kind of teaching I do a lot easier than the kind of teacher does. My brother was an elementary school teacher and then a principal for many years, and I couldn't even begin to do what he did. So, but all of that aside, what advice would I give? You know, maybe the same advice I would give the woman who asked about data. You know, that storytelling, the way we receive information and knowledge and things most readily when it's in a story, in the form of a story. And, you know, can we bring stories more effectively into the classroom? I guess that would be the question I would ask. And if you have the right story, you don't have to do a lot of extra work. You know, it's like the story does the. I was listening to a podcast recently of somebody really good, and they were telling a story from history. Then they were drawing out a very elaborate lesson. At the end of it, I was like, you don't have to draw out the lesson. Just tell me the story. The story,
Wow.
The lesson was in the story. I mean, It was like, you thought you had to do all this work. You don't have to do any work. Just, you were telling me this insanely compelling story. That's enough, you know?
Yeah. Wow.
We can figure it out. Like, and even little kids can figure that out. They don't need you to laboriously point out A, B, and C. They'll get it. You know, the human beings we are built to tell stories and understand stories.
And perhaps get it in a way that's much more personal and valuable and memorable than if you would have explained, here are steps and lessons 1 through 5 that you should have digested.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, think about the fairy tale, The Ugly Duckling.
Wow. Yeah.
You don't have to stop
No.
at the end and say, now this is about
Therefore, yeah.
a young person's struggle for acceptance, even if they are different. No. You know what the Ugly Duckling is about, right? It's You don't need any. You think about that for 2 minutes if you're a 6-year-old and you're like, oh, I get
it. When I watch movies with my kids, whenever there's this like lesson for a dad or something, or they just all look at me and they're like, right, Dad, you're paying attention, right? And I'm just like, this is a stupid movie. Quit interpreting the lesson for me. Just finish the film. Daniel from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, he asks, of anyone alive that you do not know, who would you like to have a conversation with?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, it's a hard one.
Who would I like to have a conversation with? Well, you know, Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
For some reason, I've recently become obsessed with Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
Just like to meet her. I don't know. I just like to. She's been through. I was listening recently to her commencement address that she gave, valedictory address she gave in 1969. It's kind of amazing.
Really?
I just realized she's had this incredible, fascinating life. Now, most people know that but I wasn't paying attention. I didn't read her autobiography. I kind of haven't been paying attention when it came to Hillary, so I want to play catch up. But I just thought, and I've heard that at face-to-face, one-on-one, she's incredibly warm and charismatic and funny, and so you know, could I have dinner with Hillary Clinton? That'd be fun.
I think that should happen before the month is over. Hillary, if you're watching, and we know you are, watching her favorite program, Live Signing. Colleen from Columbus, Ohio, you've interviewed so many people we didn't know much about. Extraordinary people who impacted the world. What has been the most surprising or inspiring thing you've learned about people during your career?
That almost everyone has a story to tell.
Mm.
That's the thing, that like, if you were willing to take the time to investigate somebody, when I say investigate, to find out about them, ask them questions, you know, like I said, try and see the world through their eyes, you'd be surprised at how many people have a really interesting story to tell. They have something that is worth listening to and sharing. And I would not have said that. If you asked 25-year-old Malcolm, I would have said, no. You know, there's a small group of people who've had interesting lives. Everyone else is like, it's all kind of boring. Now I don't believe that anymore.
Wow. Yeah. Joshua from Arlington, Virginia, what have you found yourself doing or researching for a topic that has been extremely outside of your comfort zone?
Well, a little bit. This book, I mean, this book is a departure for me. There's no social science in it. It's not topical. You know, the book before this was all stories pulled from the news. It was Bernie Madoff. It was Penn State. It was Stanford rape case. It was, you know, this book is like, everything in this book happens between 1935 and 1945.
Yeah.
Every major character in this book is dead. There is no fancy, you know, many of my books involve this kind of attempt to use contemporary social science to shed a light on the world. I don't do that in this book. I let the story speak for itself. So this is a departure for me in an interesting way, in a way that I found really kind of fun to do and sort of challenging. So yeah, I would say, and those of you who read this book, and if you're familiar with my previous work, it's different. I mean, in a cool way. It's me trying something, a new kind of story.
Yeah. Katie from Westchester, Pennsylvania, have you considered doing a study on gender bias and microaggressions?
I mean, it's a topic that I did an episode of my podcast in my first season on gender bias. And I talk about it in my book, Blink. I talk about how did symphony orchestras, why didn't they hire women for so many years, and how did they start to hire women, by dealing with this question of incredibly pervasive gender bias that they weren't aware that they were exhibiting. So I've talked about that piece of it. And I've obviously talked about racial bias a huge amount in my writing. So these are topics that I always circle around and come back to. So I'm quite sure I'll return to them in the future.
Mm. Well, Malcolm, this has been so meaningful to me, but that's all the time we have today. So to order Malcolm's limited edition autograph book, go to premiercollectibles.com/mafia. And whether you are a collector or lover of books, Premier Collectibles has the best-selling author-signed books that everyone wants. If you want to be a part of the live signing experience with more of your favorite authors, follow Premier Collectibles on Instagram or Facebook. Malcolm, from all of your friends who've tuned in, from all of us at Premier Collectibles, this has been meaningful for me personally, and wanted to thank you from all of us. Any parting words? How can we connect with you and follow your work more?
Well, you can, if you want to hear the audio version of my book, you can go to bombermafia.com and download it, and which, you know, it has all of the historical tape and the voices of the people I interview. It's incredible sound effects. It's almost like an audio documentary. But this has been really fun, and if you notice, I've been signing throughout.
Yes.
So these books will be available, you know, in short order.
Yeah.
And it's been really fun chatting with you, Danny.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's been fun as well, and hope to run into you again down the road.
We'll do it in person next time.
I sure hope so. Bye, everybody.